Welcome to Dreadful Visions, where we delve into the darkest depths of horror. Don't miss out on our terrifying tales. Subscribe now and join us on our journey into the unknown.
Story 1. The Night Shift Haunting. Have you ever worked a night shift? When the world is asleep and the silence creeps in, there's something about the darkness that makes everything feel wrong. Sarah, a 28-year-old nurse, had been working the night shift at St. Luke's Hospital for 6 years. She was used to the lonely hours, the quiet halls, and the occasional hum of medical machinery. But one night, things took a turn that she would never forget. It was a Tuesday around 3 a.m. Sarah was making her rounds, checking the rooms on the third floor, which housed long-term patients. She noticed room 317's door was slightly ajar. This was odd. She remembered closing it earlier because the patient, an elderly man named Mr. White, liked his privacy. She peered in only to find the bed empty. The sheets were perfectly laid, untouched, as if no one had ever slept there. Confused, she checked the chart outside. Mr. White had been there for weeks, bedridden and too weak to walk. Her pulse quickened. She headed to the nurse's station, hoping someone had moved him. But the other nurse on duty, Linda, looked at her strangely. "Mr. White passed away 2 nights ago, Sarah," Linda said, her voice a whisper. "We moved him to the morgue." Dumbfounded, Sarah argued, saying she had just checked his vitals a few hours earlier. She remembered his tired, wheezing breath and how he had weakly smiled when she had adjusted his blankets. But Linda insisted, even showing her the record. Mr. White had indeed been dead for days. Trying to shake off the eerie feeling, Sarah returned to her rounds, forcing herself to stay focused. But as she walked past room 317 again, she heard it. A faint whisper like someone calling her name. "Sarah." The voice was low and raspy, unmistakably coming from inside the room. Terrified, she pushed open the door, her hand trembling. The room was dark, save for the faint glow from the hallway. She stepped in, barely breathing, and that's when she saw it. A shadowy figure sat on the bed, facing away from her. She could see its silhouette, hunched over, with bony shoulders poking through the gown. "Mr. White," she managed to whisper, even though she knew it was impossible. The figure slowly turned its head, revealing a face so pale it looked almost translucent. Its hollow eyes stared right through her, and its mouth stretched into a twisted smile. Panicking, Sarah stumbled backward, her heart racing. She bolted from the room, her mind spinning, not caring if anyone thought she was crazy. She didn't even tell Linda what she had seen. From that night on, she refused to work on the third floor. Some say Mr. White never really left the hospital, and every now and then, a night shift nurse swears they hear a faint, raspy voice calling their name from room 317. Story 2. The Hiker Who Never Returned. Nature can be peaceful, a place to escape the noise of life. But there's a reason some places are left undisturbed. Sometimes they're meant to be avoided. Jake was an experienced hiker, the type who found solace in the quiet beauty of the wilderness. So, when he heard about a trail in the remote woods of northern Idaho, known only to a handful of locals, he couldn't resist. The trail had a reputation. Locals claimed it was haunted, that strange things happened there. But Jake was a skeptic, dismissing it as superstition and eager to explore new ground. He set out on a bright morning in late autumn. The trail was dense with trees, casting shadows even in daylight. After a few hours of hiking, Jake came across an old, rotting cabin deep in the woods. The windows were shattered, and the door hung on one hinge. Curiosity got the best of him, and he decided to look inside. The air was thick and stale, and a strange smell lingered, like wet earth mixed with something metallic. Inside, he found only dust-covered furniture, a broken lantern, and strangely, a large, faded map nailed to the wall. It was a map of the very forest he was hiking in. Someone had marked several points in red, with the words, "Do not enter," scrawled at each location. Jake chuckled, thinking it was all part of some local legend, but he took a picture of the map just for kicks. As he continued down the trail, he couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The trees grew denser, blocking out most of the daylight, and the usual forest sounds, chirping birds, rustling leaves, seemed to vanish. Everything felt still, too still. Then he heard it, a crunch of leaves behind him. He turned, expecting to see an animal, but saw nothing. He quickened his pace. The feeling of being followed grew stronger, and soon he could hear soft footsteps mirroring his own, always just a few paces behind. Trying to shake his fear, he called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" Silence. Then, in a voice that sounded just like his own, he heard, "Hello?" Panicked, Jake broke into a run, but the footsteps behind him sped up, always keeping pace. He glanced back, but all he could see was a dark, human-like figure, shadowy and indistinct, weaving between the trees. Finally, he stumbled out of the dense forest, gasping for breath as he reached the trail's edge. But when he turned around, there was no sign of the figure. He convinced himself it was all in his mind. But as he was leaving, he checked his phone. The picture he had taken of the map was gone, replaced by a new image. A blurry photograph of himself, standing alone in the forest, looking terrified. Jake never went hiking alone again, and he warns anyone he meets. If you hear footsteps on that trail, do not look back. Whatever is following you, it doesn't want to be seen. Story 3. The Whispering Neighbor. We all like to think we know the people around us. Our neighbors, the ones we wave to on our way out. But sometimes, the people next door are not what they seem. When Alex and Lily moved into their new apartment, it seemed perfect. The rent was reasonable, the building was quiet, and it was close to both their jobs. The only downside was their neighbor across the hall, Mrs. Doyle, an elderly woman who rarely left her apartment. She had an eerie habit of watching them whenever they came or went, her eyes peering out from the narrow crack of her door. One evening, a few weeks after moving in, Alex was taking out the trash when Mrs. Doyle appeared in the hallway, her usual stooped frame moving toward him. "You hear them, don't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex, taken aback, politely smiled and tried to brush it off, but she pressed on, her face full of a strange urgency. "The whispers, at night, they come from inside the walls." When he told Lily about the encounter, they laughed it off, chalking it up to Mrs. Doyle's old age. But later that night, Alex woke up to a soft whispering sound. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but as he listened closer, he could hear voices. Faint and unintelligible, they seemed to echo from within the walls, moving from one corner of the room to another. He tried to wake Lily, but as soon as she stirred, the whispers stopped. The next morning, Alex checked every vent, pipe, and crack in the walls, thinking it was some kind of draft. But everything was sealed tight. That night, as they were lying in bed, the whispers began again. This time, Lily heard them too. They sounded like a mix of hushed voices, saying things that neither of them could quite understand. The whispers seemed to pulse, growing louder and then fading, as if moving closer and farther away. After several nights of restless sleep, they decided to confront Mrs. Doyle. They knocked on her door, but there was no answer. The building manager mentioned that Mrs. Doyle had moved out that morning, saying something about the whispers getting too loud. That night, with no one across the hall, the whispers grew louder. Alex and Lily huddled in their bed, clutching each other, unable to sleep. The voices seemed to be calling their names, in tones so cold they sent chills down their spines. They decided they had to leave, but as they began packing in a panic, a loud knock came from their door. When Alex opened it, there was no one there, but scrawled across their door in something dark and sticky were the words, "You can't leave. We see you." They abandoned their things and left the apartment that night. Days later, they returned to collect their belongings, only to find the apartment locked and empty. The building manager told them no one had rented that unit in years. Alex and Lily never spoke of it again, but they both knew they'd never forget the whispers, or Mrs. Doyle's last words. They come from inside the walls.
If you have enjoyed watching this video and are a fan of horror stories and scary things like this, Please subscribe and comment down below any suggestions as to what you would like to see on this channel. Thank you for watching and have a good day.